Good evening. Before we begin this evening, I would ask that you please check your cell phones and make sure that they're turned off. Thank you very much. We all have them, and they have a way of beeping when we don't want them to. Welcome to St. Joseph's College Centennial Faculty Series. It must be time. That's the strike of 7. This evening we gather for our second faculty lecture as part of our celebration of 100 years of Mercy Catholic higher education in Maine. Some of you may know the idea for starting St. Joseph's College came at the requests of students attending St. Joseph's Academy in Portland, run by the Sisters of Mercy. Since 1912, the college has assisted students of all ages to realize their dreams through the promise of an education. Today, as we celebrate our first 100 years, we continue in the spirit of the college's motto, Fortitudo et Spes, courage and hope, and through the centennial theme, we encourage students to realize the promise in their lives. This evening, we welcome Dr. Michelle Laughran, Associate Professor of History, who will present On the Pedestal, Extreme Shoes and the Promise of Excellence in Renaissance Venice. Dr. Laughran has been a member of the faculty at St. Joseph's since 2000. She spent her childhood and teenage years living in several southern states. She attended the College of William and Mary in Virginia and completed her undergraduate degree in medieval European history. She moved north and attended the University of Connecticut, where she completed her master's and doctoral degrees with a focus on early modern European history. In addition, Dr. Laughran has spent a great deal of time in Italy, where she has engaged in extensive research in Venice, Florence, Padua, and Rome. As a colleague, she has served on a number of committees, both as member and as chair. She has served as a director of the honors program and currently serves as chair of the history department. Her publications include a number of journal articles, encyclopedia articles, and book reviews. She is currently working on a monograph entitled An Exquisite Corpse, Venetian Society and Culture in the Age of Pestilence. Dr. Laughran has presented many papers at professional meetings in Italy, Canada, and here in the United States. In April, she will be presenting Venice's Doge and his paradoxical two bodies at the Royal Body Conference at the University of London in England. In addition to all of this, Dr. Laughran, Michelle, is a delightful woman whose smile, wit, genuine concern, and care for students and colleagues is truly contagious. This evening, Dr. Laughran will talk to us about status in Renaissance Venice. And if the saying is true, that the clothes make the man, she will have us consider that it is the shoes that make the woman. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Laughran.
Thank you, Sister Michelle Laughran, for your very kind introduction, and a very warm welcome to all of you this evening who's come out tonight. I will be talking about the role that clothing, and most particularly platform shoes, had in asserting women's excellence during the Renaissance. But first, I would just like to say that the presentation that I will give tonight will be different from that which I would give to other historians at a conference, for example. The reason is because I wanted to give the general public also a sense of what it is that historians do. After all, if we look at the origin of the word history, from the Greek historia, we see that it meant not only learning through research, but also the retelling of what was learned that way. And in fact, I see my job as a historian very much one in which I try to understand what happened in the past, but also that I teach others how to come to their own understandings of what happened in the past. I know that not everybody likes history. Usually those who don't have had along the way some really dry class and think that history is nothing more than memorizing names, dates, and battles. Now, I'm not saying that that isn't at all important. I'm not saying that at all. But if that's all history was, I don't think I would enjoy it very much either. But I actually do this job because I think it's a lot of fun, and I hope to give you a taste of that this evening. So first of all, when we think about the past, even our own individual pasts, names, dates, and battles wouldn't begin to communicate the richness of our existence. Instead, as a historian, I am far more interested in the ways people live their everyday lives and perceive the world around them. To do this for the Renaissance means to be kind of a cross between a detective and an archaeologist. Except we as historians do this searching in old libraries and archives, where we dig through centuries-old books and documents, often rare or one of a kind, looking for priceless knowledge and important clues. This slide, by the way, shows one of the most beautiful libraries and archives I've ever had the privilege of working in, and that's in the Vatican in Rome. As a historian, one of the things on which I'm particularly interested is understanding better, the lives of women in the past. Since, of course, women have always been, well, about 50% of the population. Surprisingly, however, this actually isn't at all easy. In fact, as Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has famously quoted, and you may have already seen this phrase on T-shirts and bumper stickers, well-behaved women rarely make history. Now, let me emphasize that she didn't try to say this to try to encourage women to go out and rob banks or anything. She really meant this instead as just a simple statement of fact. Women in the past were most often not major players in the public sphere, and so they tend to show up in public documents only when they created some kind of problem for the establishment at the time. For the vast remainder of the female population who did not leave direct historical documentation, all we can do is try to piece together a kind of jigsaw puzzle made up often of small, tantalizing clues sprinkled throughout the libraries and archives. Now, I want to emphasize that I am not here to blame either men or women for this having been the case. That's just the way things were. My job as a historian is to not condemn people of the past based on the inevitable fact that my values today are very different from the ones that they had. One of the things I try to teach my students in my historical methods class is to try not to pass judgment on past societies, because the moment we condemn something or someone, well, we stop really trying to understand it. And one of the real goals of being the historian is instead to try to understand how and why they were the way they were. Now, I in fact want to understand better how women navigated the challenges of their world. But how on earth do you tackle such a problem if little direct documentation from them survives? Another great historian, Robert Darnton, suggests that a perfect place to start researching history in general is by finding some element which to our minds today makes the least sense, and then analyzing all the clues and evidence you can find about it until together they begin to form a coherent picture. This is why I and fellow historian and St. Joseph's colleague, Dr. Andrea Vianello, set out for our article, recently published by the University of Michigan Press in the book Ornamentalism, The Art of Renaissance Accessories, to try to understand this. This is a pair of Renaissance shoes called by various names, including chopines, zoccoli, pianelle, and even the Venetian mule, from which, by the way, we get our English word mules for backless high heels. This image, which is taken from a different article on the subject by Dr. Vianello, is from the holdings of the Correr Museum in Venice, and they stand an amazing 20 inches high. Tonight I will explain a part of what we discovered about these objects. That is, how women would utilize an unexpected item, footwear, as an instrument in their attempts to assert their own personal excellence in Renaissance Venice. Now, since a number of my students are here from Western Civ, and we've just covered this in class, not to mention there may be a few among you who would like a refresher, let's talk a minute about how excellence was defined during the Renaissance. The intellectual culture of the time was dominated by humanism. Humanism, if we have here its main elements, you have a fascination with the ancient literature and art of ancient Greece and Rome, a focus on the dignity and the beauty of man, an emphasis on the value of the individual, and something we call active virtue. Now, in this day and age, we are often used to virtue having the meaning of moral excellence. But during the Renaissance, it meant excellence more generally, more broadly. Kind of like if you think about it, somebody who's really good at playing the violin is known as a virtuoso. So it's the same usage. But the goal of all this humanistic study was not to do it just for its own sake. Rather, the goal was to put this all into action to create a successful display of one's excellence. And by the way, I have David there by Michelangelo because it's a beautiful example, I think, of all in one package, these four key elements of humanism. Anyway, Renaissance humanists, together with those influenced by them, were not shy about displaying any of this. Showing off, and even better yet, showing off with what was called sprezzatura, that is, making everything look easy and graceful, was an accepted way of demonstrating that one had achieved active virtue. I show here what Renaissance author Balthazar Castillo said when he coined the term in his book, The Courtier. Plus, I don't know if you can see very well, a button, a scan of a button that I have that I think communicates perfectly the concept of what sprezzatura is supposed to mean. In that little cartoon vignette, a mama duck is teaching her babies how to swim, and she says, "Make it look easy, but paddle like hell underneath." Now, for example, I won't bother reading all of this to you, but you can see that it is just a smidgen of what one Renaissance jack of all trades named Battista Alberti asserted about himself, and note, he is talking about himself in the third person, I might add, together with his self-portrait in a bronze medallion. For Renaissance men, being humble was not an important ideal. This conspicuous excellence was even doubly emphasized by conspicuous consumption, particularly of clothing. Clothing purchases of the time were not like they are today, since now clothing can be cheaply mass-produced in factories instead of being individually created and crafted by hand. In the Renaissance, you paid not only more for good workmanship, but also for certain materials, certain colors, longer lengths, and everybody at the time knew it. The more spectacular the outfit, the better someone signaled to his world how his own active virtue had directly provided financially for his impressive ensemble. In some descriptions, the link between ornate clothing and humanistic virtue could even be rendered explicit. When Cesare Vecellio, it's a different slide. There it is, okay. When Cesare Vecellio, who is cousin to the famous Renaissance painter Titian, published in 1590 the first ever guidebook to the clothing and customs of people from all over the world, and this is where the first image is taken from that guidebook. The second image is also 16th century. It is instead a German image, though. I included it because I thought you might enjoy seeing what that getup might have looked like in color. Anyway, Chalio said of one young man, whom he specifically stated dressed like this, that he had delivered a speech once, quote, full of new and lofty ideas in a lovely and agreeable style embellished with marvelous learning and grace that caused wonder and admiration, which, along with his brilliance, devoted entirely to virtue, earns him eternal fame. But what about women? As Margaret King and Albert Raphael Jr. write in their introduction to a fantastic book series called The Other Voice in Early Modern Europe, which publishes primarily the writings of women between the years of 1300 and 1700, humanism was a movement led by males who accepted the evaluation of women in ancient texts and generally shared the misogynist perceptions of their culture. Indeed, many humanists wondered if it was even possible for women to have virtue. Why? Well, it has to do with the origins of the very word itself. As you can see here, the Italian word virtu, meaning excellence, was derived from the original Latin word vir, meaning man. It would seem, therefore, that virtu, or excellence, was originally a quality from which women were, by definition, excluded. As a result, as King and Rabil explain, questions remained. Could a woman be virtuous? Could she perform noteworthy deeds? Was she, even strictly speaking, of the same human species as men? In other words, excellence in Renaissance Italy was a concept explicitly associated with men, and virtu inextricably linked with masculinity. As King and Rabil continue, any woman who excelled was often said to have exceeded her sex or to have possessed masculine virtue, as if the very fact of conspicuous excellence conferred masculinity even on women. As a result, any woman who wished to assert publicly her own excellence would have to deal in one way or another with these clearly manly associations of virtu. In our research regarding the Chopins, we discovered that the women's fashion of platform high heels, which developed during the Renaissance, may have allowed women to do precisely that. First, a little background on these remarkable footwear. Initially, wooden platforms were a lot like traditional Dutch wooden shoes, and had originated as cheap protective footwear among the peasantry and lower classes. As one noble discovered when he complained of all the peasants who, quote, with clogs make more noise than all the carts in the country of Hungary. These shoes, which have been called one of civilization's most successful examples of design, were so useful, however, that their concept was readily adapted by the wealthy Renaissance man about town in the form of slip-on wooden patent-style platforms, since both delicate-soled stockings or slippers would otherwise be damaged and dirtied by walking around the dusty or muddy Renaissance streets. And this is a detail from Domenico di Bartolo's mid-15th century fresco depicting the care of the sick from the hospital of Santa Maria della Scala in Siena. And if you can see, well, it's kind of difficult to see with the light, in this bottom corner here, he is wearing these kind of bridge-like patten platforms. These platforms actually facilitated men's mobility as a result, assuring that the messy urban road conditions would pose fewer obstacles of accessing the different quarters of the city, all the while allowing them to show off to ever greater audiences their conspicuous consumption and thereby also, as we've already seen, their conspicuous excellence. Women's first wearing of platform heels was thus likely an appropriation of this male footwear. Even as early as the 13th century, the preacher Capone da Todi had condemned the use of these platform shoes made of wood or cork, saying that they were already used at that time to make the small woman pass for a giant. But it was between the 15th and 16th centuries that this footwear truly began to emerge as a female fashion statement in its own right, with shapes ranging from wedges to hourglass-shaped soles and heights varying from just a couple of inches to the ponderous 20 inches high that we saw earlier. Now these pairs, again, it's kind of hard perhaps to see them. These are from the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where actually I'm going to be taking a group of students down for a study trip later this week. These are in their collection. These are probably much more representative, more common versions of the Chopins, these shoes, than those. These are probably the ones that were much more worn much more often. Now, sumptuary legislation that is, laws which aim to limit out-of-control conspicuous consumption, followed, most of which tried to limit their height. Tuscan laws, for example, periodically tried to keep the shoes to just 3 or 4 inches, like when in Florence in 1377, they forbade shoemakers from keeping ones taller than that in their shops. And as you can see here, in 1430, the Venetian government likewise tried to limit their height by law to 3.5 inches. They even included a drawing of what the prohibited shoes might look like. In addition, that same law expressed the fear that taller shoes would risk women's health and safety, since they had already apparently caused pregnant women to fall and miscarry, with great harm to, quote, both their bodies and their souls, unquote. The tallest of the chopines, or pianelle as they're also called, had tended to be observed most often in the Italian city of Venice, and were famous for being incredibly difficult to walk in. In 1494, Pilgrim Arnold von Hoth noted that Venetian women, quote, walk on great soles covered with cloth, 3 of my fists high, which causes them to walk with such difficulty that one pities them. And over a century later, travel writer Thomas Coryat also recounted, I saw a woman fall a very dangerous fall as she was going down the stairs of one of the stony bridges with her high chapines, which is what he called the chopines, alone by herself. But I did nothing but pity her because she wore such frivolous, and I may truly term them, ridiculous instruments, which were the occasion of her fall. As dance master Fabrizio Caroso, in a treatise of 1600, explained, if one is ignorant of how to wear them, one may splinter them or fall frequently, as has been and is still observed at parties and in church. How did at least some of these women cope with this difficulty? Well, by leaning on their servants, literally. Still, indications seem to be that all of these attempts at sumptuary legislation, including limiting the heights of the shoes, were pretty much routinely ignored. Nevertheless, their height was problematic for several reasons, and not just merely because it threatened bodily injury. First of all, as we've already seen, chopines clearly represented a masculinization of Renaissance female fashion. Not only were they adaptations of the patent-style clogs originally worn by men themselves in order to protect their footwear in the dirty urban Italian streets, but of course, the added height of these platforms provided women with the greater statures associated with the male physique, as nearly all early modern travel writers would note, particularly during their visits to the city of Venice. French traveler Jacques de Viamont in 1607 observed that the women there appeared, quote, a foot taller than the men because they are mounted on pattens of wood covered with leather. About the same time, Englishman Fynes Morrison claimed that the platforms made the lowest of women seem higher than the tallest men. And even at the end of the 17th century, English Catholic priest Richard Lascelles noticed that they appeared taller by the head than any man. Indeed, the fact that the use of the chopines was seen as kind of a form of cross-dressing meant that they were also worn extremely brazenly by Venice's famous courtesan population. And this is, by the way, from Margaret Rosenthal and Anne Rosalind Jones' recent masterful translation of the Chalio guidebook regarding costume. Here, in Vecellio's woodcut of one of the Venetian meretrici pubbliche, reveals that her dress doesn't even bother to cover her chopines and is sheer enough to expose clearly male-style breeches beneath it. Vecellio even comments upon them in his written description of her costume, saying that prostitutes wore their pianelle more than a quarter of an arm tall, and with their breeches, or bragasse, as if they were men, are easily recognizable. To complicate matters further, courtesans were not the only ones wearing breeches. In this print, which by the way has to be one of the earliest versions of a pop-up form of illustration I've ever seen, this image explicitly addresses this woman, identifies her as a Venetian noblewoman. And as you can see, she's also wearing male-style breeches, which were kind of like culottes or pantaloons or bloomers or for those of you when all those words are all before your time, kind of a long skort kind of thing. Those things would all develop a couple of centuries later. This was incredibly shocking instead. However, it is entirely possible that the notorious difficulty of walking on chopines might have even necessitated that they be worn together with the masculine style breeches in order to try to keep women from accidentally and embarrassingly exposing themselves in the case of a fall. No matter how hard chopines may have been to wear, though, we nonetheless seem to have plenty of references to women walking and or falling in them in public. Clearly it seems that at least some women continue to brave the difficulties posed by chopines in order to enjoy what must have been perceived as their benefits. English traveler Thomas Coriat even claimed that the shoe was, quote, so common in Venice that no woman goeth without it, either in her house or out. And in 1618, British historian James Howell would note, the Senate hath often endeavored to take away the wearing of those high shoes, but all women are so passionately delighted with it that no law can wean them from it. After all, we should not forget that the chopines gave women an edge, or maybe we should say a leg up, when trying to engage in those very same public competitions of sartorial conspicuous consumption that men did. Because the tall shoes required even longer and thus more expensive gowns, as was clearly stated when the Venetian Senate debated in 1655 reducing the height of women's shoes in order to limit also their length and thus their cost. Likewise, similar attempts at sumptuary legislation throughout Italy would periodically entreat tailors and dressmakers to take a lady's measurements only, quote, without shoes at her feet, unquote, precisely in order to try to curb this kind of abnormal spending. In fact, by the beginning of the 17th century, again, traveler Thomas Coriat reported, quote, that this is observed among them, that by how much nobler a woman is, so much higher are her chapines, which is what he called the chopines. Contemporary legislation would also seem to support this observation that the height of their pianelle seems to have reflected Venetian women's social status. When earlier in 1650, Venetian nobleman Niccolò Bon proposed placing yet another limit on that height of the shoes, which was nevertheless twice as tall as the one that had been imposed back in 1430. Have I mentioned that these laws are never paid attention to? They keep trying to make them and nobody pays attention to them. Nevertheless, though they proposed it, this measure would be soundly defeated, in part because the ruling nobility did not want new legislation that associated noble women's shoes with the lower platforms of their commoner counterparts, since, as we have already seen, they provided the opportunity for incrementally higher statures, longer gowns, and therefore greater prestige. In addition, when the Venetian Senate had discussed in 1655 the subject of reducing the height of women's shoes in order to limit also the length of their gowns, an old Venetian senator rose and argued rather that their height, which was apparently by then, with the fashion already a little bit in decline, should be increased by law in order to keep wives and daughters from leaving home easily and going freely around the city. He was supposed to have said, they would go to all the parties and scorn their houses, and such bad government would ruin the family. Visitor, Father Richard Lascelles, even thought that the pianelle, or the chopines, were, quote, a pretty ingenious way either to clog women at home by such heavy shoes, or at least make them not able to go out far alone or invisibly. And not only were women more visible in chopines, but they were also often far more noisy. Renaissance dance master Fabrizio Caroso had complained of, quote, some women and gentlewomen who slap their chopines along as they walk, so that the racket is enough to make one crazy. More often, they bang them so loudly with each step that they remind us of the clogs of Franciscan friars. As a result, he would give lessons to women who wore chopines that were more than a hand's breadth and a half high on how to seem to be wearing chopines that are only 3 finger breadths high. Also, how not to flash their chopines in the process, which was perceived as being kind of gauche. In that way, he claimed, a true lady could wear tall pianelle, but in the name of that effortless-looking sprezzatura about which we talked earlier, would ideally make them seem as graceful as physically possible, so that these women would, Caruso insisted, quote unquote, make an impressive sight. And an impressive sight it was, indeed. It turns out that chopines were actually also an incredibly effective way for women to dominate physical space, not just vertically, but also horizontally. In his incredibly insightful article, The Geography of Gender in the Renaissance, historian Robert C. Davis contrasts the well-known seclusion, isolation, and even veiling of upper-class women at the time in Venice with their reappropriation of the otherwise male-dominated urban landscape, precisely through their use of chopines. Now here's an image, this is again from Chalio, and this is showing the very common way that Venetian noblewomen were expected, if they were even to leave the house, which was rare, as you can tell in this description, they would have had to be completely veiled in the process. Citing travelers' accounts, Davis describes Venetian gentlewomen on their tall pianelle venturing out to church, which was one of the few places that they were allowed to go outside of the house, and needless to say, going very slowly. And not only did they move slowly, but they moved in big crowds with, quote, troops of waiting women, unquote, as the French diplomat Alexandre Saint-Dizier asserted. And because they were at least a foot high, as traveler Villamont had recounted, they were obliged to have a woman aid them walk and another carry their train, he said. And Englishman John Evelyn was struck enough about it to hyperbolize about the ladies on chopines about 10 foot high from the ground, stalking together with the rest of their world about half as high or more. Together, these women could effectively choke Venice's narrow pedestrian thoroughfares, forcing men to wait for them to pass. It must have been a full-blown spectacle, Davis writes, designed not only to command public attention, but also to assert the preeminence of female space. Clearly, it was an effective micro-strategy of power which turned the Venetian upper-class social norms of women needing to be unseen, secluded, and clogged on its head, and maybe on its heel, to the woman's own advantage. Even if the women were, as Lascelles put it, supposed to be clogged at home in Venice, and not only by those heavy shoes, they seem, at the very least, to have really enjoyed having the shoes so they're not able to go out precisely, either alone or invisibly. Which brings us to the last point, enjoyment. While we lack women's own testimonies regarding their wearing of chopines, we do know that their use in Venice continued far longer than in other places, where starting with the 17th century, the style had largely given way to wearing more delicate small shoes with a completely separate heel that was developed in France and had been disseminated from there. In Venice, their continuance probably had to do with the fact that the island's city required that people could not be transported with horse-drawn carriages, for example. They had to go by foot, or, you know, there is the possibility of going in gondola, but most often than not, you would travel by foot. And the fact that Venetian women had a unique amount of financial control over their own dowries after they got married probably allowed them to have greater access to the acquisition of these unusual shoes. But the simplest explanation may well be that they enjoyed wearing them and also enjoyed the resulting incomparable spectacle of their very conspicuous consumption and hence, as we have seen, the spectacle of their conspicuous virtu or excellence. Indeed, famously powerful women, famously virtuous women, had impressively worn and shown off their chopines, as in the case of Duchess of Milan Beatrice d'Este, whose very effigy on her tomb at the Certosa di Pavia clearly reveals her wearing for all eternity her relatively tall pianelle, which are right here. And this was, the women in Milan were famous throughout Italy for preferring a little bit lower chopines. So she's quite remarkable that she's got them as tall as they are here. While the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Eleonora of Toledo, owned literally dozens of pairs of pianelle, and in 1 year alone had 34 pairs made for her. As a matter of fact, everyone familiar with the story of Cinderella may be surprised to hear that the shoe left behind in the heroine's flight from the palace was originally not a glass slipper. It was a chopin. In the original 1634 version by Battista Basile, who had himself spent time in Venice before writing his folklore collection in the Neapolitan dialect, the story goes like this. The king took the slipper in his hand and said, "Oh, if the foundation is so lovely, what must the house be like? Oh, beautiful candlestick, where can the candle be that consumes me? Oh, tripod of the beautiful cauldron in which my life is boiling. Oh, beautiful corks," and remember, the shoes are made out of cork. "Oh, beautiful corks attached to the fishing line of Cupid, with which he has caught the soul. Behold, I embrace you and hold you tightly. And if I cannot reach the plant, I shall adore the roots. And if I cannot possess the capitals, I shall kiss the base. You have already captured a white foot. Now you have taken hold of a melancholy heart. Through you, she who rules my life is taller by half a foot. And through you, my life grows in sweetness as long as I hold and possess you." Unquote. In conclusion, as I hope you've discovered this evening, history can be tremendously fun, especially when we come away with it with a greater understanding of what seemed almost unthinkable and preposterous before. Rather than dismiss and condemn the chopins as a ridiculous eccentricity of Renaissance women, we've learned, however, that these shoes were actually a physically and financially demanding investment which allowed women to literally heighten their own virtue or excellence. In much the same way, 17th century nun, author, and social critic, Sister Arcangela Tarabotti, would also defend chopins from such off-handed criticisms, and with tongue firmly in cheek, insist, precisely because chopins were the reason women wore longer gowns, that the footwear ought to be praised rather than condemned, because they were, quote, creating a living picture of modesty. What's more, she clearly saw their powers deriving primarily from their virtue-enhancing relationship with the woman who wore them. It was only right, she explained, that women who are, quote, a miracle of nature, should be elevated by the chopins, since they were, and I'm again quoting, almost like sacred images placed on pedestals covered with most precious draperies. After all, Tarabotti did not hesitate to affirm, quote, you never find magnificent and great things on the ground, but instead raised on high in order to fill others with wonder and reverence. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions, and we do have a traveling mic that will make its way over to you if you would like to ask a question for me this evening.
Fascinated by the geometry of the shoes, and I wonder, did you ever see situations where for the sake of stability, they would have attached it more like modern stilts, where there would be almost a bracing that would go up part way up to the knee that would help stabilize the pivot at the foot, such that you would fall over less often, or is it always just really quite such a pedestal?
I have actually never. They would have loved that idea, I think. They were used. I mean, since they were often worn as essentially kind of overshoes, where you sort of would slip your stocking feet into them, and then just sort of shuffle. And well, actually, a number of them, as you saw maybe at the sumptuary legislation. I mean, you could actually have it tied onto your foot with laces, but that's a great idea of the brace. Mostly, as you saw, I mean, there's some theories that we don't have, I haven't seen images to this effect. There's some theories that women might have used canes to kind of, again, leisure, learning how to start with stilts maybe. Use canes to stabilize yourself. But the one we do have an image for is actually using, your servants as sort of, canes, except people. Yes. If I may, up there, it's oh, there's one right here? Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks. You may have gone over this, but I'm trying to sort of capture or recall the initial male response to the women's use of chopines. So why is it that they were threatened by it or bothered by it? It would seem to me that if it was an example of conspicuous consumption, the husbands would have been encouraging this sort of thing to sort of, because if they were the breadwinners, then the more opulently dressed their wives are, the better they look. But it sounds like that wasn't the way it started out. Maybe it ended up that way, but...
It actually, there is this love-hate relationship that men seem to have with the chopines. In other words, one man might like the fact that his wife is able to be all the more opulent because she wears them, but doesn't want her to then try to lord it over him, number one. And then number two, doesn't like then that there are other people who are also doing the same thing, which is then driving your own expenditures for conspicuous consumption up just by keeping up with the Joneses or the Giovannis or something. So they don't like I said, they like to have it for themselves, but they don't like it they're afraid it's a slippery slope, I think, is the bottom line, both in terms of having to spend ever more money on the expenditures and in terms of what they feel also is a masculinization of the woman's stature and part of the role which kind of evolves out of that. Okay, one moment. I thought it was only appropriate, since the talk was entitled "Extreme Shoes," that I should wear some. Oh, thank you. Now, my fear was actually, because we do have plenty of documentation of women falling down in these, that this would just be, my talk tonight would be another one. But so far so good. But yes, these are, what's interesting is that, I mean, while there is right now the fashion for stiletto heels is quite prevalent, there's also a move also toward these really tall platforms. And so these are from a designer named Jeffrey Campbell from Los Angeles. So, thank you.
It seems if they're that high, they'd be dangerous. Your trip and could fall flat in your face, don't you? Break your neck. I mean, how dangerous were they, literally, from a breaking limbs viewpoint?
Well, are you talking about the historical shoes or the ones I'm wearing? Oh, okay. Because surprisingly, what's very interesting is that surprisingly, because it's got the platform on the bottom, at least the ones I'm currently wearing, because it's got the platform on the bottom, the actual rise of the heel is only maybe a couple of inches, 2 inches, maybe 3 inches. So it's actually surprisingly, they don't look it, but they'd be surprisingly sensible. For women, yeah, there are, especially if anybody's been to Venice, you have the pedestrian thoroughfares are periodically punctuated with bridges, and the bridges are not smooth kind of round bridges. They're bridges with marble steps. And, even in flats, people slip on those bridges. And so it would be extremely, extremely dangerous. But that's in part why, if you had the resources, you could have, for example, troops, as they said, troops of waiting women that came with you to keep you stabilized. is all, again, you were able to, by ensuring your safety, it took an awful lot of people to help you stay upright, and that was also another way of showing how much wealth and how much resources you had at your disposal in order to be able to try to, stay safe.
Thank you, Michelle. I thought that's a fascinating lecture, and I was just thinking about, do you now tend to look at shoes in general as making statements about things, and are you constantly analyzing that? And I was thinking about a couple years ago when there was the controversy about young women wearing flip-flops to the White House. And, what other, does the fascination with flip-flops say the opposite of the 20-inch platform shoes? And, do you find yourself making those kinds of examinations of what?
In terms of, actually, what's interesting is when I first started out with this topic, and I was going to go make sense of Renaissance shoes. And I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was with a group of students that I had taken down there. And while they went off and looked at some of the things that they were interested in, my goal was that I was going to mine Renaissance paintings for everything I could tell about women's footwear in them. And the problem with that is that you can't see women's feet in most of them. And that's deliberate. The idea is that the feet are supposed to be sort of shameful, and they sort of need to be covered. It is interesting in terms from a modern perspective. It's interesting the role that flip-flops are having today, to the point where actually, and I don't quite know exactly where that's coming from, because it would seem to be the opposite of conspicuous consumption. Unless, there are some designer flip-flops. People will invest in designer flip-flops with crystals on them and cubic zirconia and things. But it is impressive because it's a rejection of utilitarian footwear. It's even if it's an expensive pair of flip-flops, your first reaction is, ooh, look at the flip-flops. Nobody has that. Nobody's really usually very impressed with them, and it is even to the point where this past summer I was actually looking at archaeological sites in ancient archaeological sites in Greece. And I would be stunned because people would be like scampering over archaeological sites wearing flip-flops. And it's just like, it was like the worst idea ever. It's kind of like, going hiking on the Appalachian Trail in flip-flops. It's just a bad idea. So it is interesting. But I'm afraid that I haven't gotten to the bottom of that one yet. No.
Do we know exactly when the first pair of Chopins were worn by women? Because it does men started with them, but when was the transition? Who was the first person to be like, I want to wear them too?
Again, no, we don't really have that first reference. It seems to be what does seem interesting is that, well, actually, for a large percentage of human history. Men and women's shoes, they were unisex. For most of human history, shoes were unisex. You would, to this day, actually, in some cases in the middle, if they're doing an excavation of a medieval archaeological site, and they run into maybe a pair of, every time men they do, a pair of leather booties that they found, they will not be able to identify that as being a man's shoe or a woman's shoe. That starts to change really with the advent of almost the proto-Renaissance, when the Renaissance starts to kind of get moving very slowly in Italy. Those urban economies start coming back. And we're talking about 13th century approximately. Then you start getting an increasing number of fashions which are gendered and are explicitly considered male or explicitly considered female. And so that's what I think is shocking initially when that preacher Capone da Todi in the early 14th century, I think it was, lamented about the wearing of the chopines because it was still considered a fashion statement, basically. But beyond that, in terms of who was that brave young woman who got out there with the chopines, we really don't have that evidence yet.
I'm morbidly curious. Can they be used as lethal weapons if need be?
Probably. The ones that are 20 inches tall, those, you can't actually, you're not allowed to handle them. I've stared at them often on the other side of the glass case. Those are understood to be sometimes made with like a wood frame, maybe filled with cork, because otherwise also they'd be extremely heavy. So yeah, maybe that was another reason men were worried that women had them. Questions? Sure.
I'm just really interested in how this phenomenon shows when you increase autonomy that we
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if this was a result of the increased affluence created more opportunities for teachers, and therefore more opportunities for women to express their own.
Well, they do say, that's one of the links that they make to Venice is that uniquely among Renaissance cities, Venetian women did have a greater direct access to their own financial resources. In other Renaissance Italian cities, women would have had to go through the men in their lives to be able to access financial resources. And so it is perceived that might be part of the reason why this just incredible style of shoe continues long beyond. In terms of the other alternative, but what's really odd is that women in Venice are famously known to not be allowed out of the house. So their autonomy is limited. But where it does seem, though, that where they can exercise it, they go whole hog, and hence these shoes. No, not at all. Actually, what's interesting is a lot of times people think in terms of gender history. They think that it's been a steady progress over time from the first civilizations. The situation for women has just gotten better, and every era is better than the one that preceded it. It's actually that in the Renaissance, for women of the upper classes, it was actually a more restrictive environment than it had been during the Middle Ages, interestingly. And part of the reason for that is that there had been, as part of all this conspicuous consumption that's going on, and also these competitions essentially in conspicuous consumption, dowries also go through the roof. And and dowries are what a woman's family would give to the groom upon the marriage. And that was actually originally designed to be a kind of insurance for the women, so that upon the termination of that relationship, either more commonly actually, if the premature death of the man, the woman would have like a nest egg that would then revert back to her. But in the meantime, in places like Florence, they helped drive the commercial revolution that was happening in the city at the time, because people would then invest the money in new business ventures and hope it would pay off before they had to pay the dowry back. And with that inflation of dowries came it was inversely proportional basically to the amount of freedom that in terms of freedom really that women were accorded by that society because they wanted, it was like a kind of investment, and they wanted to keep that very tightly controlled. And and this was very, very different from what had been the case during the Middle Ages, actually, in a number of places. Yes, Donovan. Okay, one last question, yes.
Do you have a sort of a background sense of the role of height in the whole society? For example, how taller men were perceived versus shorter men, taller women versus shorter women, and so on. And I wonder if these Chopins key into the whole issue of height in general as a kind of background factor.
Actually, that's a very good question, because that actually causes me to think of a whole new angle on this that I had not initially contemplated, and that is that one of the things that was very popular during this era was physiognomy. In other words, it's kind of like palmistry, like reading people's palms and trying to figure out what they're like or what their future's like, except it was with people's faces, and it was even beyond the face. It would even go to your entire sort of structure of your body and everything. And certain characteristics were perceived more positively than others. One of the other articles I've written has been on the history of cosmetics, and one of the things about cosmetics in the Renaissance is that you could fake some of these characteristics that were viewed positively through this kind of face-reading system of physiognomy with cosmetics. And I never really considered, and there is a preacher who complains that the Chopins make liars out of people because they make them look tall when they're not. And one thing I really never thought about is what would be the physiognomic reading of height in terms of actually, and you can find books that'll say, oh, if somebody's this tall, they might, well, honestly, I've never looked in terms of height, but they might say, oh, if they had a tall forehead, for example, that was perceived as being very positive. And in all these little variations of a person's appearance would be deciphered in these books, and you could just look them up. And I've never looked at what the height sections might say.
And just a coda to my last remark, although I was thinking outside of Italy, I was thinking comparatively about the Chinese and the Manchu dynasty and the whole foot binding thing. And what a contrast this is, because this is these Chopins represent an impediment to walking, which somehow is turned around paradoxically for these women living larger. But the foot binding custom imposed upon Manchurian women and then Chinese women by extension is really just a suppression, or so it's been interpreted. And I thought that maybe this might provide some very interesting comparisons.
No, in fact, I'll have to give that a lot more thought, but thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. I really appreciated your questions.
I just want to say, far more interesting than names, battles, and dates. You have elevated shoes to a whole new level, Michelle. Thank you so very much, and please accept this on behalf of the committee.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and we will have refreshments out in the foyer for you. Thank you.